flour, water, salt, yeast, and a flit gun. That's all you need to make your own French bread. Today on The French Chef.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Welcome to The French Chef. I'm Julia Child. French bread, like Gaul itself, is divided into three parts. You have the making of the dough, then you have the forming of the loaves, and finally the baking. And I'm going to go into the first part first, which is the yeast. The dough. And for the making the dough, you have to have yeast. And I'm going to use dry, active yeast. And those are these little granules that are dry, and they're not active until you put some water to them. So in those little dry granules go into 1/3 cup of warm water. And it takes about 4 or 5 minutes for the yeast to dissolve, and it has to dissolve completely. So don't let anyone try and hurry you up about this. It just takes about 4 or 5 minutes, and let it, while it's dissolving, we can get to the rest of the dough, which of course is flour. And we want 3 cups of flour. In France, you would be using French flour, which is unbleached. And so you would use here all-purpose flour, and don't use the so-called bread flour because it has too high a gluten content. The French flour has a rather low gluten content. And if you can get unbleached flour, it's much the best. And we want 3½ cups. And when you measure it, be sure that you measure it like this. Dip your cups into the flour and even it off with a spatula or something. And you don't need to sift. And 3½ cups are about 1 pound, which is what you want. And I've tried various kinds of flour, and the French bread is easier to make with French flour naturally, just because I think it's manufactured for making French bread. And I have found that unbleached all-purpose flour works very nicely. And if you can't get unbleached, you can use the regular well-known brands that you can find in your supermarket. But don't try experiments at first until you get used to making bread. And now you want to have 2½ teaspoons of salt. And this you want to measure very carefully because the salt has a lot to do with the color of the bread as well as with its taste. And if you don't have enough salt, you find that the bread won't. That's 2¼ teaspoons. 2 teaspoons and 1/4 teaspoon. There. And do measure that because that is very important for the taste and the color. And then you get your yeast is thoroughly dissolved, and in it goes. And then you're going to have 1¼ cups of tepid water, and be sure that you measure that exactly. And in that goes into the bowl. And then you stir it around with a spatula just to get it thoroughly mixed. And you're going to be surprised that this is an amazingly soft dough. And then out it goes onto a board. And then you want to let it rest for about 2 minutes. And the reason you let it rest is so that the flour will absorb the water, and then you can tell what the dough is like. And then after it's rested, I'm not letting it rest the way it should, you start kneading it. And you take a scraper of some sort. You can chop it up a little bit. And then start just turning it around. This should really be a little softer than it is. But you begin pushing it around. And if it's quite soft, see, I didn't let it rest, so I can't really tell how much the water content is. But when you let it rest, you'll see what happens. But now it's really beginning to soften up a little bit. But the reason that you're kneading is because flour is made of gluten, and flour has gluten and starch in it, and the gluten molecules are like glue. And when they're moistened, they join together, and what you're trying to do when you knead is to get all the gluten molecules together to form a kind of a mesh all through the dough. It's rather like sponge rubber because they're all joined together. And that's what makes the dough elastic. So you keep kneading like this for about 5 minutes or possibly 10. And then after it's beginning to look a bit like dough, you let it rest again for a minute, and then you start in again kneading. Now here's some more. This is really more of the better consistencies it should be. See, that is much better. That's quite soft the way it should be. And you keep on kneading until it begins to look smooth. Now look at the difference between the two. That's rather rough. That's the one that hasn't rested. And this is the one that has rested, and it's begun to be smooth. You see it draws back. But it's still soft. If you pinch it quickly, it doesn't get onto your hands. But if you pinch it slowly, it sticks. But it is very definitely elastic. And then you can be sure that your gluten molecules have joined and that the dough is kneaded. And I think with this soft dough, the gluten molecules join themselves much more quickly. And so it's really easier to knead. I shall knead this other one a little bit more now that it's rested, and we'll see what happens to it. But it's interesting, though, looking at these two. This is the proper consistency, this very soft, and this I must have done the measuring too fast. It's a little bit too stiff for proper French bread. And it's better to have it a little bit soft at first, because you can always add a little bit of flour later on than a little bit too stiff. So that was really a useful example of right and wrong. And now, after it has been kneaded and looks smooth, into a bowl it goes. And then I'm going to wash off my hands. And then it has to rise to 3.5 times its original bulk. It's about 3 cups now of unrisen dough. And then after it's risen, it's supposed to be to 10.5 cups. So what you should do, always make your bread in the same bowl. You know that with 3.5 cups of flour, and you always use the same bowl, rather straight-sided. And 3.5 times 3 is 10.5. So measure 10.5 cups of water. Make a mark on the bowl where that is, and then you know that your dough is to rise up to this point. And this is not like most recipes that you see where the dough is to rise 2 times. Because what happens to this dough, it has to be covered so it won't crust over. What is happening to this dough, and I think you've got to have some idea of what's going on inside of it so that you will understand why all the rising. The yeast is now active, and it's feeding. It's greedily devouring all the starch in the flour, or as much as it can feed upon. And as it's greedily eating, it's multiplying itself and gasping and giving out gases. And these gases push up this mesh of gluten so that the gluten is rising, and that makes the whole of the dough rise. And at the same time that the dough is rising, it is slowly developing flavor and texture. And these are 2 of the very important parts of the rising, that it be done slow enough so that the dough not only rises but develops this flavor and texture. And that's what makes a very simple dough like French bread absolutely delicious. So that you have to give it time. It must have at least 3 hours. And the way you give it time is to raise it at a not too warm temperature. It should rise at 75 degrees. Most recipes you see say let it rise at 85 degrees. That's a fast rise, and you're not getting the benefit of the yeast. So remember, a minimum of 3 hours, and it's to come up to this point here. And if you don't have it, I mean, you can let it rise in a cooler place, and it will take longer, which is very nice. Now, here's an example of risen and unrisen dough. You see, it's to come up to there, and look at those. You can see little holes and bubbles. And it's come just up to that point. So that's what it's to look like, and it has a lovely soft feel. And at this time now, your first rise is complete, so it goes out of the bowl, and it's to be deflated. So cup your hands and scrape around the side of the bowl. This, again, is quite a different system than the usual one you see where you just punch it. And out it comes onto your board. And then with your lightly floured hands, you pat it out a little bit. And then you flip one side over. Then you take and you flip over another side. And then you take the other one, fold it completely over. And then you take a clean bowl or wash the one that you use. And with your hands, lift it gently up and put it same side down into the bowl. And it is then to rise again. And it's got to be covered again. I'm going to get my other bit of yeast here. And then this is to rise again. This is risen again to just about, not quite 3.5 cups. I mean, not quite 3 times. And then this gets deflated. And the reason that you have the two rises is to develop the flavor and the texture that you're not going to get unless you let it rise these 2 times, and unless you let it rise always at a temperature of not any higher than 75 degrees. So this has its second rise, and it really has developed a nice texture. And I'm going to the second part of the bread saga, which is forming the loaves. And we're going to make 3 long loaves, which are called baguettes. And so I'm going to cut it into 3 as neatly as possible, folding each in half as I do so. And then it has to rest for 3 or 4 minutes to let the gluten relax. As you can see, there's a tremendous difference in the look of the dough now and the way it did before. As a matter of fact, I think this angle, this is a very typical look, that ridge. And the forming is just so important that I took a private lesson in Paris at the École Professionnelle de Meunerie with a marvelous teacher called Professor Raymond Calvel. And this is the professional baker's school in Paris, and I think we're just terribly lucky that we were able to film this and that we can all see a real professional at work.
Les dernières petites boules devant chaque copain, et puis nous allons commencer les baguettes.
Now we're going to do the baguettes. That's the good long bread.
Un bâton.
There,
Merci.
voilà.
Alors là,
Because you have to do this very fast if you have a whole lot to do.
voilà.
Voilà. Je peux essayer? May I
Vous
try
pouvez
one?
essayer, oui, bien
Bien.
sûr, Madame Tchaf. Voilà.
Voilà.
Vous prenez un bâton, un pliant,
Bâton, and when you take it up,
vous le pliez,
you fold it as you take it up. That's fold
puis-
number 1.
vous égalisez.
And then
Votre main bien à plat. Voilà. Ensuite, vous repliez vers le centre.
fold it up towards the center.
Vous égalisez encore une fois.
Beat it down again,
Vous ramenez encore le bord.
and then bring it
Sur le-
over on
sur le
itself
centre.
again. Really, faut
puis,
appuyer vraiment.
égaliser tout. Oui, 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 oui.
Make it the same
C'est
length.
C'est bien. Et puis, vous faites un sillon
And then you make
ici.
for this
Cette
part of the
partie.
hand, make a trench down the middle.
Et puis, vous rabattez les
Fold
deux
it, and
bords
that's the
et vous
final
soudez.
fold.
C'est bien.
I think it makes a little funny little noise.
C'est très bien.
Voilà. Et puis,
Et puis,
then,
avec une main d'abord,
and then
là,
with the one hand
vous
there.
faites rouler.
And
C'est
you
bien,
should hear
très
the
bien, très
sound.
bien.
Il faut entendre le
Il
son.
faut entendre le son de la main. Encore une fois, vous appuyez, et voilà.
Voilà.
Bien,
there
madame.
it is. It's not
peu
very
gros, là.
even there.
Oui, un peu gros ici.
A little. Professor Calvel is constantly changing his techniques. When we had a lesson from him before, he formed his bread in a slightly different way, and that's the one we have in our book. But they all work, and I'm sure that if we went again today, he would have changed his methods again. But I'm going to follow just the method that we saw. And so here we start. You pat it out, and then you fold it up to the third, and you pat it out again. And you will notice that working with this American or other all-purpose flour, that it's rather resistant to patting out frequently. And now, this was where he took his hand and went like that. And if you prefer, you can take the side of your hand and go like that. But the whole object of all this fancy forming is to make an even the bottom of the bread and to create surface tension, because there is, though you can't see it, you have to believe it, that there is a gluten cloak that's forming. If you find it hard to roll out, I have that on a marble, I'll do it on a board here. But you'll notice that the dough is somewhat resistant. And then you flour the canvas and you lay the bread on. And this is a regular pastry canvas that you get anywhere, and the flouring will just keep it from sticking. No, I didn't get that rolled out very far, but I'll do another one. We're going to look at Professor Calvel again. But if it's recalcitrant like this, sometimes you can roll it on canvas. But anyway, we'll go back to Professor Calvel and back to the lesson, and let's take a really close look at how he's forming his bread. Nous pouvons faire une
Très lentement. Alors, on égalise d'abord. Premièrement,
First, we're stretching it out to make it all
ensuite,
even.
on
And then
replie la pâte sur elle-même.
and it's only
Et
comes up to
à
there.
peu près,
so
oui,
you
sur le
just
milieu.
up to the middle.
Et ensuite, on égalise à nouveau.
And then you stretch it. Then you equalize it again with the palm of your hand. Oui.
Le dernier
Then
côté
you
est
turn
plié.
it over again.
À
oui.
nouveau
Again
égalisé.
you equalize it. That we need to make it the same thickness. Oui.
On fait un sillon au milieu.
And then you want to make a little trench down through the middle avec votre
Avec
main,
cette
with
partie du pouce,
this part
la
of
base.
your hand. Oui. Yeah. Mhm.
Et ensuite,
Yes, and then you
en
turn
dernier lieu, on rabat
And that's the final time you turn it back on itself.
et on soude les
That's
deux bords.
avec la paume de the
Toujours,
palm
toujours
is
avec cette partie de la main là.
hard, unhot part. And you're squashing it down together to seal it.
Et puis,
And then,
on allonge la baguette ensuite.
in this, see, en dessous,
On met la
ça, cette
soudure,
partie-là,
la
c'est-
soudure
that's-
dessous
seal is underneath.
et
And then with your two hands, one on top of another,
on imprime au bâton un mouvement de
you
va-et-vient.
go a coming and going movement,
On fait rouler le bâton sur le tout.
and moving your hands toward the end.
On entend la main qui travaille.
And you have to hear the hand working. You see how soft that is. It's just amazing. There now, his is marvelous, I see, and ours is, of course, not as long because you're limited by the size of your oven. I can only make a bread about, having 17 inches long. Because remember, that was first folded up, then folded down. So technically, this bread is not called a baguette, but a bâtard. And there was making that trench down here, and then folding it in half again, and pressing it down. Just try to remember when you're doing that what you're doing is making a gluten cloak. And then starting this way, rolling it out. And this naturally takes some practice, and sometimes it's rather slippery, as it is now. Often if it's arisen a little bit too much. So now, there's the second part of the bread is done, and it's going to rise, and it has to rise at about 75 degrees again. And it's to rise until it's almost triple in size and feels nice and soft. And use a room thermometer to check on your temperature. And now we're going to see the final step of the bread. After it's risen, we're going to see the very important part, which is the slashing and the baking. So we'll go back to our lesson with Professor Calvel.
Donc, avancer.
See? This is the great moment. This big piece of furniture is where the bread has risen.
Voilà.
There, all ready. Et c'est bien poussé.
Ils sont bien poussés.
They're nicely risen. It's got to be right away
Mais
baked.
Ils sont fragiles.
And they're fragile at this point. Il faut travailler toujours vite, vite.
Toujours vite.
Always quickly, quickly. You see when he's unmolding it
Monsieur,
so it's upside down,
je
the
vous
soft part. Vous le démoulez sans verre, n'est-ce pas?
Alors, oui,
There's a big long one.
on les
Yes.
met sans dessus.
Right. And this is the slashing of it, makes the patterns.
On a une lame à plat.
And it goes practically flat. And they've got to be very regular and straight. Why is it so important?
Parce que si la coupe est mauvaise, le pain a un mauvais aspect.
If it isn't done right, the bread doesn't look right. And a good cup allows the bread to expand.
Très
Don't
léger.
rise up again. That's the cut that makes these lovely patterns and also allows the expansion. Now you want to take some cornmeal, and as you noticed, he was using a kind of a board to mold things, and just get a piece of cardboard or anything. This is the bottom of a bureau drawer. And then you want to flip the bread over. Now this really has risen very nicely. Notice that it's on the, you flip it over and turn it onto the underside because it's the underside is soft and the top part would have crusted. And this, I've got cornmeal on this baking sheet so that the bread won't stick to it. And now we come to the real art of the baker, which is the slashing. I'm going to use a safety razor. And you make 3 slashes in this bread, this is the 18-inch size. You start on the left-hand side and you cut almost parallel to the table. And there's the left-hand side, and then you make a middle slash that goes slightly biased, and then another slash on the right-hand side. And note that you cut somewhat at the center part of your razor blade. And this takes years and years to do, and if you're a real whiz you don't make little jagged lines. You want to do it quickly and almost parallel. And this is done just at the very last minute. And then if you want to make this like a baker's oven has steam, so you either paint the tops of the loaves or you use a big flit gun like this and squish some water onto it, and then into the bottom of a preheated 450-degree oven. And you want the bottom because you want it to give it a big push at first. And it's going to take about 25 minutes in all, so set your timer. And then at minute 2, open the oven door, flit gun in hand, woof, wink, ooh. Close the oven door, and then at minute 4, open the oven door, flit, flit, ooh. And finally, at minute 6, open the oven door and put the bread up under the middle level. And by this time, it will really have been puffed up quite nicely. And spray again. If you don't have that kind of a spray, use a little nasal spray and quickly spray. And the reason for this is, not to be silly, it's to give the yeast a little extra time to make the bread rise, and because it's moist, and then also to set the color because there's coagulated starch on the surface of the bread, and that colors it, and it's that which gives it this nice brown color. And then, at around minute 20, open the oven door, and you've got your beautiful bread, and pick it up and go thump. And as soon as it thumps, you'll think it's going to be done, but it ain't. Really, it's because, and I think this is because it's a home oven, the inside of it hasn't completely dried out, so that if you take it out, the inside is still damp, and that's going to make the crust a little soft. So I found a good thing is to turn the oven off and leave the bread in about 5 minutes or so longer, and then take it out. And then usually it's nice and crisp. And don't expect it's going to come out like Professor Calvel's in the film, because it isn't, because you can't really duplicate a baker's oven. But this is pretty nice bread. Now listen, it's crackled. Doesn't that sound nice? And then you take a knife and cut it open. Listen to that sound. And look at it, a lovely creamy color, and you've got all those holes in it, just the way it's supposed to be. Once in a while, you'll get a rather queer-looking loaf, but it'll usually bake into bread, and don't get discouraged if it doesn't turn out perfectly the first time. Just remember that Professor Calvel bakes a big batch of bread every day of his life. It's just a matter of practice. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon courage.
The French Chef has been made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation. Julia Child is co-author of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2.